Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you. I was talking earlier that I was in Kansas yesterday, talking to a whole bunch of people, and today I'm in Illinois, and I didn't have to leave my bedroom. So there are a few nice things about virtual meetings. I apologize I can't be there in person, but tonight I want to talk about. Well, let me start by giving you a quick tour of Nebraska in case you haven't been here. If you're a prairie fan, we do have a lot of prairie in Nebraska, including the western edge of the tallgrass prairie. I actually live right on that transition between tallgrass and mixed grass prairie, and this is a prairie that my family has that is right on that border. So we have prairies that can be really tall in years of a lot of rainfall, but they can also be, you know, waist high or thigh high at the tallest in a drier year. That's what makes mixed grass prairie really interesting. But Nebraska is really known prairie wise probably for the sandhills, which is an incredible landscape of about 12 million acres of contiguous grassland, kind of right in the north central part of the state. It takes up a big old part of the state. And it's just an incredible place with huge skies, huge landscapes. It's almost exclusively privately owned by ranchers and really well managed because the ranchers are concerned about soil erosion. If they overgraze, they're worried that the sand is going to start blowing and the dunes that the sand hills are formed on would start moving again. Um, it's probably actually a little bit overblown fear, but it doesn't hurt to keep everybody a little on the conservative side in terms of the grazing. And so the landscape is just in really good shape. It's got a lot of wetland habitats in it as well. And then if you haven't been to Nebraska, or if you've just driven through Nebraska on the interstate, you might think it's a pretty flat state. And there is some of that, but we've got at least some topography. This is a place I want to highlight really quickly called our Niobrara Valley Preserve. I work for the Nature Conservancy as the director of science, and one of the big perks of my job is getting to spend time up at the Niobrara Valley Preserve, which is 56,000 acres. We have about 25 miles of riverfront along the Niobrara River, which is a national scenic river, or at least that stretch of it is. And then we're also right on the north edge of that sandhills landscape I was talking about. So of that 56,000 acres, about 48,000 or so is sandhill prairie. And then out in the western part of the state, we've got some really cool landscapes too. We start to get some rock outcrops. This is Nature Conservancy's Cherry Ranch, way out in the northwest part of Nebraska. So with that quick introduction, what I really want to talk about tonight is that when most people think about nature or go looking for nature, I think most people would think about big animals, sort of charismatic animals, right? So like deer, or maybe if you're a prairie person, you think about bison, which is understandable. And a lot of people get into birds because birds is a nice gateway into nature. And so you might, if you're a prairie person, you probably know what a meadowlark is. If you're a serious birder in prairies, you probably also know what a bobolink is, and maybe even an upland sandpiper, which is a species that's really common in the Nebraska sandhills because we've got the scale that it needs, and it's a lot less common in places where the grassland's more fragmented. But what I want to talk about tonight is looking closer at prairies, because a lot of what's in prairies is much smaller than that. And what's great about the smaller stuff is that it's in every prairie. So you don't have to be at a 56,000 acre nature preserve to see bison, or you do have to see bison in a larger area like that, but you don't have to be at a scale that size to see a lot of other things. If you know how to look closely, there are a lot of things that are hidden right kind of beneath the surface of a prairie. And if you think about all of the life that happens in a prairie, or really any natural system, it's only a very small percentage of species that are vertebrates. You have a lot more plants and way more invertebrates that make up sort of the pyramid, if you want. And then that's not even counting things like bacteria and fungi and all those little microbes that live in the soil and other places that I don't have good photos of, so I'm not going to talk about, but I'll recognize their importance here. And the importance of having a lot of different kinds of species is that the more species you have, the more diversity of function happens within a prairie, and you get some redundancy built in. So you might have one species that plays a particular role. If that's the only species that plays that role, that's not a very resilient system, because if that species disappears, the role doesn't get filled. But when you have a lot of different kinds of species, there's a lot of overlap in the roles that they play. And that does lead to ecological resilience, which is going to be sort of a key phrase and theme that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I want to start talking about plants, and I want to categorize them a little bit. So one way to categorize plants is by grasses and forbs, which are more broadleaf plants, and woody plants, trees and shrubs. But you can also look at their lifespan. So you've got some species that germinate from a seed and grow and flower and die all in 1 year. Those would be annuals. Biennials do that over a couple of years, where they spend 1 year kind of just as a low-lying rosette of leaves, and then the second year, or sometimes later, they'll bloom and then they die. And then you have perennials, which you think about trees as being long-lived, but I would put a lot of prairie plants up against any tree in terms of lifespan, because, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, they're almost immortal as long as nothing eats them. They could really live almost forever. And then you can look at the time of year that things are blooming. So there are plants that are blooming even before a lot of the other vegetation greens up around them. And then there are plants that, bloom in the middle of the season or the later season, really up until the frost. And then there's habitat types, right? So you've got wet areas, you've got dry areas, and everything in between. I think one of the more interesting ways to categorize plants is by whether they are a dominant plant, something that sort of rules over everything else, that can sort of push other species out of the way, or if it's on the other end of that spectrum as an opportunistic plant that only appears when competition from other plants are low. So in prairies, a great example of that dominant plant species is big bluestem. Big bluestem is a species that, if it is at least in a lot of sites, can become really dominant. It's tall, it can grow densely. We'll talk about its root system here in a minute. And then on the other end of that spectrum are things like western ragweed, which is a perennial, but it's a species that doesn't compete well with tall grass. And western ragweed might not be everybody's favorite, especially if you have allergies to pollen. But it's a good example anyway of a species that can take advantage of low competition from grasses. And it provides actually a lot of really important resources, including the seeds, which are one of the best food sources for birds during the winter, and small mammals actually. But here's another example here's a biennial plant that is called 4-point evening primrose. And it's a short-lived plant that is thriving in this picture because of grazing. This Sandhills prairie was grazed really hard the previous year by bison. And this particular patch of prairie is in kind of a recovery stage from that, where the grasses are still fairly short. You can see in the background, some of those grasses are maybe 8 inches tall, 10 inches tall. And these 4-point evening primroses are about 2.5 to 3 feet tall. And they're just thriving because the grasses are not strong. And all of those things, all of those species and all those different categories come together to form communities. And the communities that we're going to talk about mostly tonight are prairie communities. So let's think about below ground for a little bit, because with prairies, what we see is above ground, but a lot of the action is below ground. So a lot of the competition between all those different categories of species happens below ground. And a lot of it actually is tied up in other kinds of organisms besides just plants. There are bacteria, there are microorganisms, there are fungi that attach to the roots of different species of plants that help them get nutrients and gain a competitive advantage. Some of these plants are putting out chemicals to subdue other plants and to give themselves an advantage. Some of them are changing the nitrogen or the nutrient environment around their roots. It's an incredibly complex area that's really hard to study because it's underground. But we do know some things, and I know some of the things that other people know. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure we talk about is, if you know anything about prairies, you probably have seen photos or drawings of the deep root systems of prairies. And prairies do have incredibly deep root systems. But one of the things that we've learned mostly in the last 10 years really is that the deep root systems are a little bit misleading in terms of where plants draw water from. So the way we understand it to work today is that grasses really dominate maybe the 10 to 12 inches at the top of the soil profile. So the first 10 to 12 inches down is dominated mostly by this very thick mesh of grass roots, very fine roots, and rain that falls on top of the ground is going to get pulled up most of the time by those grasses before a lot of other plants get a chance at it, which is one of the reasons that grasses are so common in prairies. The next zone below that, so the next foot or so, tends to be more commonly dominated or used at least by forbs, those broadleaf plants, the wildflowers. And it's not that grasses don't have roots there. Grasses do have roots throughout the entire profile of the soil. But what they're seeing with research now is that even in dry years, those grasses are not pulling water almost ever from below the top 10 or 12 inches. And they've never really seen or been able to document them pulling water from 3, 4, 5, 6 feet down, even though they have roots that deep, which obviously brings up an important question of why do they have roots that are that deep? And I think the leading hypothesis right now is that they're using those roots to store carbohydrates, to store carbon for themselves for future use. And I guess it makes sense if you think about it. If most of the animals and the other things that might eat your roots are up in that top layer, if you can put roots down below where a lot of that potential risk is, it's sort of like just putting money in your safe deposit box or putting money in the bank where you can get it later. It's fairly secure. But it's a little weird that you've got these roots that are very deep that don't seem to be pulling water up for the plants. And then that bottom zone, again, while wildflowers and grasses are there, the water that's being pulled out of that deep zone is almost exclusively by shrubs and trees. And that's interesting in a lot of different ways. One of the things that's really interesting is with climate change, if we start having more extended droughts or more severe droughts, that's going to probably favor trees and shrubs with those deeper root systems because they're the only ones that are going to really access that deeper water during a really dry period. And then I want to talk about how plants move around and how they reproduce, how they sustain themselves. And so seeds, of course, are a big part of that. And seeds can be dispersed and move around the landscape in a lot of different ways. This goldenrod seed moves from, the wind carrying it around, but you've got things that are carried by water or carried by animals, either in their fur or because they're eaten. But seeds are an important way to move. The problem with seeds is it's a very high risk situation, right? If you think about a seed that flies off into the wind, the chances of that seed landing in a place where it's got bare ground that it can hit, and so that it has a chance to germinate, where there's enough available moisture in the soil because there's not a lot of competition around it, so that it can successfully germinate and survive on the moisture and the nutrients that are available, that chance is very low. And then it's also really low that you're going to find a place where you don't have a lot of shade that's going to prevent light from hitting you. So bare soil, nutrients and moisture and light, it's really hard for a seed to just sort of fly off and land in a place that happens to have those. So most seeds don't turn into anything, right? They either get eaten or they just die and they biodegrade. Some of them do work, and the advantage of seeds is that they tend to be, it's a great way for plants to move further distances than a lot of their strategies, which include things like rhizomes. So a rhizome is an underground stem. And you can see in this picture, these grasses are connected by that white line. That's an underground stem called a rhizome. And what that does is it acts like an umbilical cord so that this grass can move and spread and reproduce and spread through the prairie while still being connected to a parent plant that is supplying it with nutrients. So as a competitive advantage, that's huge, right? You're competing for very scarce resources, and you're getting this pipeline of help from your parent or your sibling, or however you want to look at that. And then the other thing with those rhizomes is, if you look at them really close, at every segment there's a bud. And those buds are opportunistic. They can turn into roots. They can turn into stems or shoots to go up. They're really flexible and are plastic in terms of what they can do. And so you can have a rhizome that at any point, that plant can decide, hey, I'm going to put up another stem right here because it seems like there's a good opportunity to do that. Or I'm a little short on nutrients. I'm going to put down some more roots. And I want to stick with buds for a second because buds are awfully important and under-recognized, I think, by people who study prairies even, let alone people who are just sort of casual enthusiasts about prairies. But if you're a perennial plant, the way that you survive year to year has almost everything to do with buds. So on the left is a grass, on the right is a wildflower. In both cases, you can see those little buds that are right below the ground surface. So they don't poke up above the ground like they do on a tree or a shrub, where in the spring you see the buds swell and they become leaves and stems. These are the buds that are going to be next year's stems most of the time. So for example, on that grass, those shoots that are growing right now this year are going to die at the end of the growing season. And then next year, they're gone. They're not coming back. The next year's growth comes from the next set of buds that the plant chooses to deploy. And then if something happens to that plant during the year, if it gets grazed off or burned off or just stepped on or whatever, if the shoots that are growing now die, the plant has the option of deploying a new bud to replace the shoot that was lost. But if it does that, it's depleting its bank of buds. So there's a bud bank, just like a seed bank in the ground. There's a bud bank underground. And there's only so many buds that are available at a certain time. And then the plant has to invest energy in creating more buds. The reason this is important is that, like I said earlier, if some of these perennial plants are essentially immortal, this is what I meant. Because really, as long as a plant can keep getting enough energy to create the next set of buds, those buds will continue its life above the ground and below ground. It can turn buds into roots or shoots, and it just kind of keeps growing year after year after year. Where a plant would die is either getting dug up, of course, or if it gets stressed enough that it loses all of the investment above ground, all the shoots go away, and it just doesn't have enough energy to replace those with new buds. So buds and below ground stuff in prairies is just super important. And then, just kind of continuing along the competition thing, plants compete in some really amazing ways. And some of them, like this is a plant called Pussy Toes, because it has little cat feet looking flowers. This is it in full flower. And Pussy Toes is not a very tall plant. It grows early in the spring, blooms early in the spring. But because it's a short plant, it has this really interesting strategy to keep itself from being shaded out more than it could. And that is it uses allelopathy, which is another word, it's a fancy word for chemical defense, basically, or chemical attack. So it puts chemicals into the soil that suppress grasses, especially, and their growth so that they don't get shaded out. And in the prairies that I'm familiar with around Nebraska, where we have a lot of grazing, the combination of grazing and that chemical defense means that these Pussy Toes plants, you can find colonies of these that are, the size of a good size house. It's a very effective strategy. And then there's some plants that go even further, which is that these are on the left is a plant called broom rape, and on the plant on the right is called paintbrush. And both of these are parasitic plants. So they don't have their own chlorophyll, especially on the left one. They get all their nutrients from other plants. So they basically just connect themselves to another plant, put in a little pipe or they kind of tap that plant and put in a little straw, and then they just start pulling all the nutrients out of the plant. It doesn't usually kill the other plant. It just sort of takes away, siphons off some of their nutrients and gives these plants enough to survive. And this is another parasitic plant that you may have seen and not even recognize what it was, which is a plant called dodder, D-O-D-D-E-R. It's a parasitic plant that can be a pest. There are some species that are pests in gardens or farms. This one is a native species that generally attacks things like sunflowers and goldenrod, which are pretty common in most prairies. And what it does is it just creates, it doesn't have its own chlorophyll. It doesn't photosynthesize. It doesn't make its own food. It just has these long orange strands that look like nylon twine, basically. And it climbs itself up the flower or up the plant that it's living off of, siphons the nutrients off of it, blooms, produces seeds just like any other plant without ever having to make its own food. Okay, now that was sort of a lot of general information on plants. I want to focus in now a little bit on a few different kinds of plants. And I want to start with sunflowers, because sunflowers are, a quintessential plant in prairies, of course. And there are a lot of different species. So in Nebraska, we have 9 different species of Helianthus, which is the genus for sunflowers. They're the official sunflowers. 7 of those are perennial plants. 2 of those are annual plants. Those are all native species in Nebraska. I don't know what Illinois has. I'm guessing it's a similar number. And then there are a bunch of other plants that look like sunflowers, right? That have similar structure, similar color, and actually provide a lot of the same resources and functions that a sunflower does. And some of those include food for animals that specialize on sunflowers. So here's a longhorn bee, which is one type of one of our native bees. And this particular species is a sunflower specialist. So it has to have sunflowers to feed on. That's the nectar and the pollen that it gets to supply itself and its babies food it only can get from sunflowers. And then there are other species that use the pollen and nectar out of sunflowers, but they're just generalists, like this tree cricket, and they'll eat, anything from any plant. Sunflowers just happen to be a really good source because sunflowers literally put food on a platter for whoever wants to come get it. They don't hide it away in a cave or make a structure on their flower that an insect has to sort of pull open or dig into, or you don't have to have a long tongue to access the nectar. It's just all right there. So there's a lot of species that get a lot of good nutrients and food out of sunflowers. And because of that, there are predators that know that they can just wait around and take advantage of that attractiveness of sunflowers. So here, for example, is a crab spider that caught this little cucumber beetle that came to feed on pollen. And all that crab spider has to do is sit there like a crocodile in a watering hole in Africa, knowing that animals have to come to it. So it's a great place to be. And then another interesting thing about sunflowers is they produce this extra floral nectar. So this the sweet substance that is like nectar, but it's not produced by the flower parts that you think of typically. It's produced in bracts and other parts of the flower and other places. In this picture, you can see some of those droplets of extra floral nectar as those kind of shiny things on the back of the flower here. And what happens when you produce that sweet substance is you attract ants. And ants are major predators in prairies. They're, wolf packs, or they're more impressive than wolf packs. It's not even fair to call them wolf packs. They're way better than wolf packs. And they hunt, and they're really good predators, but they also have a sweet tooth. And so if you provide sugar water for ants, they're going to use it and they're going to come to it. And so if you think about the combination of really good predators, lots of them, you can attract them to yourself if you're a plant, and you're basically buying protection, is what's happening, right? Now, in this case, you can see that this plant has had a hard life. It's been chewed on quite a bit. So the ants are not a fail-safe, but it's a pretty sweet idea to, invest a little bit extra energy in producing a resource that's going to bring you some predators to help protect you. And then because those predators are coming, that crab spider and other predators just have more food to choose from as they sit in ambush on a sunflower. And then the other thing with sunflowers, of course, is the seeds. And if you are somebody who feeds birds, you probably know that if you fill your bird feeder with sunflower seeds, it's going to be very popular. And then, even we eat sunflower seeds, right? It's a big package, relatively big package of lots of nutrients all in one place. So birds like this bobwhite, but many, many, many other birds get a lot of value out of seeds, as do many other wildlife species, including a lot of small mammals especially. And a lot of larger animals, including things like bison or cattle, will also eat sunflowers, both the leaves early in the season, but also just as they start to bloom. All those resources are sort of packed into that bud of the flower right before it blooms, is in a particularly attractive time for them to get eaten by a lot of things like bison. Okay, so those are all the fun things about sunflowers. There are a lot of some fun things about sunflowers, but I want to tell a story quickly about a drought in Nebraska during 2012. 2012 was the worst single-year drought in Nebraska and throughout a lot of the Great Plains. And at the Niagara Valley Preserve, which I talked about earlier, we had the combination of that very severe summer drought. And then in late July, there was a wildfire that was sparked by lightning that ended up spreading across something like 74,000 acres, I think. And about half of that, about 35,000 acres, was on the Nature Conservancy's property. So about 35,000 acres of the Niagara Valley Preserve burned in late July. To be honest, the fire was not a huge stressor. I mean, we use summer fire as a management tool. So it was a stressor for people who were worried about, losing their house and their lives, and it took out some fences, and it cost a lot of things money-wise. But ecologically, what was really the bigger stressor was the drought. But the combination of those two things together were really stressful on the ecological systems. And what was interesting is the next year, a lot of plants were not very productive, right? They had a hard year because of the drought. For some of them, the fire was an added stress just because it sort of made everything a little drier. wildlife were looking for a place to go and looking for resources. And one of the things that really stepped up, one of the species that stepped up, was sunflowers. So this is the same landscape a year later, and these are annual sunflowers called plains sunflowers, and they just exploded onto the scene, really across the entire sandhills, but especially at the Niagara Valley Preserve and our neighboring properties where that wildfire had come across. And so they filled in a really important gap in resources when a lot of other plant species were not really doing very well. And so all those things we just talked about that sunflowers provided were provided in 2013 when it was a pretty stressful year otherwise. And then we can recreate that same kind of explosion with management. So this is one of our bison pastures, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure this is correct, that in Illinois, there's something like 7,500 acres of unplowed prairie across the entire state. One of our bison pastures, the one here, is about 10,000 acres. So we have a very different kind of scale of prairie in Nebraska, where we have, a single bison pasture that's bigger than all the remnant prairie left in Illinois, which is both interesting and sad and frustrating all at the same time. But in this prairie, we burned about 1,000 acres in the spring out of that 10,000 acre patch. And the bison really honed in on that because that's what they do. And they grazed mostly all the grasses down, very, very short. And you can see there's a lot of bare soil here by July. A month later, that was filled with sunflowers, which had germinated in the spring after the fire. They liked the bare soil. They liked the lack of competition. And they really took off and provided a lot of resources in this area that otherwise was looking pretty barren, although, providing a lot of habitat for species that like that bare ground also. So just to wrap up sunflowers, there's 9 species in Nebraska. Not only does that mean that there's always going to be a sunflower in a particular spot that's going to do well, it also means that if you look across different habitat types, there's sort of a sunflower for every habitat. And the importance of that is, as climate continues to change, and some areas are going to warm up and dry out, and some areas are going to get wetter during floods, and there's all these conditions are changing, it's still very likely that 20 years from now, 50 years from now, and 100 years from now, there's still going to be a sunflower in almost every habitat. They just may be in a little bit different places than they are today. But that's a reassuring thing to me in terms of thinking about resilience in prairies. So the other plant that I want to highlight is milkweed. And a lot of people know milkweed right now because of its contributions to monarchs. And when people picture milkweed in their head, this is probably what they think of, right? Big plant, pink flowers. But there are 17 different species of milkweed in Nebraska. And again, I'm sure it's similar in Illinois. And they come in all different kinds of colors and shapes and sizes. And milkweeds are great pollinator plants. They're also something that, because of the white latex sap, it's not even sap, it's a latex toxic fluid that is in milkweed plants. It's separate from their sap system, but it makes those plants really hard to eat for most insects. But there are some, like the Longhorn Milkweed Beetle, which have adapted to that and figured out how to deal with that toxin, or the large milkweed bug has a similar strategy. And then, of course, monarch caterpillars, right? And monarchs can use all those different kinds of milkweed. They have their favorites among those, but they have access to all of them, and they can grow and reproduce off of any kind of milkweed, which is a really good thing, because in 2017, we had an unusual occurrence with monarchs in Nebraska. So normally, if you know about monarch migration, the ones that leave Illinois and Nebraska in the fall, they head south and they get to Mexico. They overwinter in Mexico, and then those same individuals fly into the southern US the next spring, and they lay eggs in places like Arkansas and Mississippi and Oklahoma, places like that. So they find milkweed plants in the southern US, they lay eggs, and then the caterpillars that hatch out from those eggs grow up to be monarchs adults, and those adults are the ones that we see in Nebraska and Illinois. That's the way it happens most years. So we are the second generation out of Mexico normally. But for some reason in 2017, we had a whole lot of monarchs that came further north in the spring than they normally do. And so they arrived in Nebraska in April, which is about a month early. And you could tell that they were all the way from Mexico and that they'd been alive for a long time by how faded they were. So if you look at this monarch, it is really dull colored, right? It's had a long, interesting, probably rough life, has flown, thousands of miles. And so we had this wave of monarchs that came in. They were hungry, they were tired, and they were desperate to lay eggs so they could die. And there wasn't a lot out for them to eat. So dandelions, which are a non-native wildflower, and of course, many people see them as a pest. Dandelions helped save the bacon for monarch caterpillars or monarch butterflies that year because they were abundant in providing nectar and pollen, or nectar for butterflies. And then the other thing that helped was it was early enough in the season that a lot of our milkweed, the common milkweed, which is what monarchs usually gravitate toward to, had just started to grow. And then we'd had a big freeze that had knocked a lot of it back. So there was no common milkweed to be had in the landscape. What there was whorled milkweed. And it wasn't blooming like this at the time, but this is what it looks like when it blooms, just for context. And whorled milkweed is apparently more tolerant to cold because it was still green when all those other milkweeds were gone. And so that became the only food source really for most of those monarchs. And so here's a tiny little monarch caterpillar, and there's an egg right next to it. And actually, if you look at that caterpillar, there's actually an egg laid on the caterpillar, which is probably a parasitic fly, something we'll talk about later. But we had enough whorled milkweed that we raised that next generation of monarchs from the parents that made it all the way to Nebraska for some reason in the spring. Everything was fine. But the only reason it was fine is we had multiple species that could overlap with each other in the ways that they support the ecosystem, which is, again, resilience. So that's a nice segue to talk about invertebrates. And if you remember that pyramid earlier, if I was doing this talk in a fair way, we'd be talking about invertebrates for about 10 hours. I don't have time for that. You don't have time for that. But I'd want to talk about a few different species and groups of invertebrates. And you can, just like plants, you can break these down in a lot of different ways. These are just some examples, right? So you can have herbivores, you can have predators, you can have pollinators and seed dispersers who also are herbivores or predators, but happen to play these other roles. You can have really interesting things like parasites and parasitoids, which get a bad rap, but are incredibly important in terms of controlling, especially species that have these big cycles up and down that can become problematic when they get too abundant. And then invertebrates live above ground and below ground. Many of them live both above ground and below ground at different times of their life. And if you think about biomass, or just sort of the amount of insect weight and size that's out there, the biomass of invertebrates below ground is about 10 times what it is above ground. And again, just like roots, we know it's important. We know there's a lot going on. We don't know a lot about it because it's just really hard to study. But I want to talk about bees. I want to talk about pollinators, but bees are really the pollinators that are the most important for most species. And I want to start with honeybees, but only because honeybees get, I think, way too much attention. And I want to talk about that, and then I'm not going to talk about honeybees anymore. So you hear about pollinator losses, you hear about declines in bee populations. And most of the time when somebody talks about bee pollinator or bee declines, what they're thinking about in their head is honeybees. And that's really misleading because honeybees, are basically an introduced livestock species, right? They're a species that came to North America in the 1600s with Europeans who brought honeybees with them because they brought crops with them that they were used to having honeybee pollination for. So they brought this species over from Europe, introduced it into the North American system, and it did very well. The other thing with honeybees is that while it's true that a lot of honeybee colonies are having trouble, there's all kinds of issues between pesticides and mites and parasites, all these things that are happening, they have people taking care of them, right? So if a honeybee colony goes away, disappears, those people that are running that hive are going to get more bees and start the colony again. So they've got a built-in support system, which is us, which is very different than most of the other bees I'm going to be talking about. And there's also growing evidence that honeybees can compete with a lot of our native bees, which actually do much more in terms of the services that prairies and other ecosystems need. Honeybees pollinate a fairly small subset of native flowers. So while they're really good at what they do, they can't cover everything. They're not built for that. So as an example, we have native bumblebees in North America. And in most states, they're going to be similar in Nebraska. We have 20 different bumblebee species in Nebraska. I'm sure Illinois is in that 15 to 20 range too. And then if you look beyond bumblebees, all the other native bees that we have, most states are in that 400 species range probably. And then if you look at North America, it's closer to 5,000. That's a lot of different kinds of bees. And most of them are native. Almost all of them are native. Most of them are not social. So they don't have the queen and worker system that honeybees do. They're just built very differently. In fact, most of them are solitary bees, and they come in all different shapes and colors and sizes, which means overlapping roles, all that diversity and resilience we talked about earlier. Some of them are tiny, so they can fit into small flowers to get the resource that bigger bees can't get. Some of them have longer tongues or shorter tongues, which allows them to get nectar from certain plants and not others. Some of them know little tricks to get into flowers that other bees don't know. And some of them just carry different kinds of pollen or carry pollen differently and act differently. So all of them are important in different ways, and as a composite, they make sure that pollination happens. And of those native bees, most of them are solitary bees, which means you're really talking about a single mom trying to raise her family, often in a hole in the ground. And if you look at what a bee nest looks like, almost always it has this little raised edge around it if it's a hole in the ground. The other way you might see it is they'll also use hollow stems to nest in, some of the different species. But really the majority that I'm aware of in Nebraska are these ground nesting solitary bees, so single moms. And inside that hole, that female bee is in charge of laying eggs, and then she goes out and she collects pollen and nectar from different kinds of flowers. She puts that pollen and nectar together in kind of a little dough ball, sticks it next to an egg that she's laid, and then she seals all that stuff together in a cell. And then when the larva hatches out of the egg, it's got food right there to eat and has enough food that it can eat until it grows up to be an adult, and then it can leave the nest. So it's a self-contained little incubation chamber that she makes. And then she stacks those on top of each other within the tunnel. She does that all by herself, including getting the food. And then when she's not out getting food, she sits at the edge of the nest like this and protects it from all kinds of things that want to come in and eat either the eggs or the pollen and nectar or the larva or all three. So this makes it really important when you think about flowers, because when I talk about flowers here in a minute again, remember that you've got one bee that has to do all of that. And if she's not there, the whole nest disappears. So many bees, like bumblebees, are generalists, where they can feed from all different kinds of plants and they can travel long distances. But there's others that are like this blue sage bee or pitcher sage bee, which feeds only on that plant. So this blue flower is called pitcher sage or blue sage. It's a salvia, if you know what salvia is. This bee, as far as we know, feeds on nothing else besides that species of plant. I think it's amazing. It also has blue eyes, these gorgeous blue eyes that match the gorgeous blue flower that it feeds on. This one's a male, and you can see both males and females feeding on the same plants. But the females of the species do just what I talked about with their little nest, but they're only out for, say, 3 weeks out of the year, because that's as long as that pitcher sage plant is blooming. And so that's their only food source. So they stay underground the rest of the year. They don't emerge as adults until the time when pitcher sage blooms. And then another group of bees that's fascinating are the kleptoparasites, or the cuckoo bees. And if you know anything about birds and you know about brown-headed cowbirds, you know that brown-headed cowbirds lay their eggs in other birds' nests and then they just leave. So they're a nomadic species. They don't have to invest at all in raising their kids. They let somebody else do it. Cuckoo bees are the same thing in the bee world. So cuckoo bees will find the nest of another kind of bee, and they specialize on different kinds of bees themselves too. And then they just go into the nest when the female's not there. They lay their eggs right next to the other eggs, and then they leave. And their larvae hatch out, and they're bigger and more aggressive than the host larvae, and they'll kill the larvae of the host bee, and then eat all their food, and then they grow up to adults and they leave, which is a fantastic strategy if you're the cuckoo bee. It's not so great if you're the other bees. So when you wrap all of that together, you've got bees that are very diverse as a group, right? And so they can ensure that pollination happens for all different kinds of flowers, because they feed in different ways and they can access different flowers. At the same time, though, especially for bees that are out for a long part of the season, they have to have consistent pollen and nectar sources that they can access close to their nest, which means they need a lot of different kinds of plants, right? Because every plant only blooms for a few weeks, most of them. And so they'll feed on one kind of plant or a few kinds of plants in the early part of the year, and then a few weeks later they have to switch to something else because those flowers are gone. And if you think about those bees in a nest and that single mom bee that's trying to feed her kids, she has a limited distance that she can travel from the nest, both because she just can't fly that far, and also because the longer she's gone, the more danger it is that something's going to happen while she's gone. So she needs to have a lot of different kinds of flowers close to her nest so that she can stay alive, get the resources she needs, and also protect the nest like she needs to. So what you have is this kind of relationship between diversity of bees is important to flowers, and a diversity of flowers is important to bees. And if you combine those together, you get a healthy ecosystem in terms of the network of flowers and bees. Okay, I want to talk about flies. And before I start talking about flies, I want you to think in your head really quick, how many different kinds of flies can you name? Just name them to yourself and count them. All right, if you got more than 5, that's really impressive. And no, dragonflies don't count, butterflies don't count. Housefly, there's 1, deer fly, horsefly, and then it gets tough, right? Okay, well, how many species of flies do you think there are in North America? Think about that number for a second. And I'm going to blow your mind, because the estimate of the species number in North America is 61,000. So think about that, 61,000 species of flies in North America. Now, not all of those have been identified and cataloged by science yet. So that's an estimate, but it's probably at least an accurate estimate, if not conservative. And if you start looking around at all the different things that are flies, there's many, many, many of them, and it starts to be a little less surprising that there's that many, although 61,000 is still an impressive number. But a lot of them are pollinators, just like bees, but they act differently. Some of them are on different kinds of flowers. They're not as effective as bees, but they are important, especially for some flowers. And so some of them are this little hoverfly, which is not very fuzzy, which makes it a little less good at pollination. Some of them look a lot like bees. And if it wasn't for the short little stubby antenna and the fact that they have 2 wings instead of 4, you might reasonably think that this is a bee. Here's one that they actually call a bee fly. It's also called a bee wall, like a narwhal, because it's got a very stiff little proboscis that it can't retract or fold. It's always sticking out in front of it. And so it can hover in front of a flower and stick its proboscis in to suck the nectar out. Bee flies are really cool and very cute little teddy bear animals. And I'm going to talk about them again in a little bit. And then if you look at, here's pussy toes. Remember pussy toes earlier, the chemical defense plant. Here are 3 different kinds of flies that I photographed feeding off of it all in the same day. And I want to highlight this one because this is a tachinid fly. And here's a different kind of tachinid fly. Tachinid flies are interesting as adults. They're feeding on pollen and nectar. They're helping to do some pollination services. But as larvae, they're really interesting. As larvae, they are parasites or parasitoids. Parasites other way around. Parasites don't kill their prey, parasitoids do. And with flies that are parasitoids, this fly would lay its egg on a caterpillar, like the little one we saw on that Monarch Caterpillar earlier. When that egg hatches, the larva digs inside, burrows inside a caterpillar or other kinds of insects. They specialize on different species, and they basically eat them from the inside out, which again, it's not kind. Right? It's not something that sounds very happy or friendly, but if you have a species of caterpillar, for example, that's really on an upswing in that particular year that can do a lot of damage if there's too many of them, one of the biggest ways that nature sort of controls those population swings are with things like parasitoids and parasites that can kill those species and knock them back pretty quickly. So tachinid flies, really important, really fascinating, not necessarily kind. And then there's things like crane flies, which actually look like mosquitoes, but they're not. They're much bigger. They don't have any kind of a ability to bite you. And then mosquitoes, while we're talking about mosquitoes are flies. So the order Diptera, which is the flies, includes mosquitoes. So you can throw those into that 61,000. Some of the more fascinating ones, though, are predators, like this robber fly. So here's a robber fly with great big eyes, and it's got that black mouthpiece or mouth part injected right in this case into a little tiny leafhopper. So it's feeding on the juices of that prey right now. When it catches its prey, it injects a venom into the prey to paralyze it, and then it liquefies the inside with that same, it kind of basically digests it inside its own body, and then it just sucks the juices out. Same thing that spiders do, except that spiders don't generally fly around and catch their prey in the air like robber flies do. And this is just unfair, because this is also a robber fly that looks incredibly like a bumblebee, right? And so you imagine this poor little beetle was feeding on a flower, and it looked over next to it, and there's a bumblebee sitting there. And it's like, that's fine. Bumblebees, I see bumblebees all the time. They're just doing what I'm doing. They're getting food. And then that was the last thing that beetle ever thought, because then it got caught and injected with venom and liquefied and eaten. And then I want to talk about grasshoppers. And you might think grasshoppers, I know of everything I know about grasshoppers. They're either green or brown and they eat grass, right? Well, first of all, in Nebraska, there's 108 different species of grasshoppers, which is a pretty impressive number. In Illinois, it's probably less than that, but not considerably less. You tend to have more grasshopper species the further west you go in North America. They like hot, dry areas more than humid areas, but there are plenty of species that do very well in the humid sites of Illinois as well. And there are some that are very green, and there are some that are very brown, and there are some that are a combination of green and brown. But there's also some really fascinating looking grasshoppers, like this one with bright red antenna, a little hump on its back. This one is called the Plains lubber, and it's about the size of a large mouse. So this is a handful. You know, if you hold it up in your hand, it's about the size of, it's bigger than my thumb, both in girth and length. And it's a flightless grasshopper. So this is a full-size adult, and those wings that you see, that kind of salmon-colored wing with black spots, that's the size of that wing. It doesn't get any bigger than that because it doesn't use it to fly. It's a vestigial wing. So this thing sort of walks around in the prairie. It can hop, but usually it just sort of walks around in the prairie and feeds mostly on wildflowers. So it's not a grass-feeding grasshopper. It feeds on forbs, the broadleaf plants. And then there are some that are just amazingly colorful. Like this is a painted grasshopper that has lots of other names, of course, because it's a really recognizable grasshopper. It's another flightless one. You can see its wings there are very small, and this is an adult. But I think for me, at least, it's the most beautiful grasshopper I've ever seen. And in different parts of the western prairies, some of them are more orange, some of them more red, some more yellow. And then there are some really well camouflaged species. So this is a toothpick grasshopper, which in both shape and coloration has an amazing color or camouflage against the grasses that it sits on, including the stripe there that looks just like a stem of grass. I think maybe my favorite camouflage grasshopper is this one though, which is the Sagewart grasshopper. And I want you to notice, not only does it have the same color as the sage plant that it's sitting on there, the white sage or sagewort, but even the little green dots on its face match the texture of the plant that it's sitting on. It's just amazing. And these are species that, you know, you would walk past sage plants that are in the prairie, you'd never see that grasshopper. The only way I ever find them is I sort of kick my foot through the sage and I flush them out, and then you see these little white things jumping out, and then you can catch them and see them and look at them. Otherwise, I don't know how you'd ever see them just walking past. And then there's some bandwing grasshoppers, which are known for being super camouflaged, and they really like bare ground. So they spend a lot of time basking in the sun, in bare soil, and feeding on plants along the edges of those bare spots. And they're, again, you know, really well camouflaged. The other thing about bandwing grasshoppers, though, is that when they fly, they have a defense mechanism where they both make a sound, like a clacking sound. So if you've ever kicked up a grasshopper and it goes clack, 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 that's a bandwing grasshopper. And as they do that, they have these very colorful wings. It's almost like butterflies. And so you could be, you know, easily mistaken into thinking this is a butterfly when it flies off, except for the sound, which is just crazy, crazy loud. And then just for fun, nature has things that look like grasshoppers but are not. So katydids are related to grasshoppers, but they split off evolutionarily a long time ago. And there's some important differences. One is that their antennae are much longer, and that's the way to tell them apart. If you see something that looks like a grasshopper, but its antennae are as long as its body or longer, that's not a grasshopper. Katydids have antennae that are really, really long. And while grasshoppers are very short antennae. So if you look back at that grasshopper, it has short antennae, right? Katydids have long antennae. The other thing that's really interesting with katydids is that grasshoppers hear through little openings on the side of their bodies. along their abdomen. Katydids don't. Katydids hear through their elbows. I don't know why, but if you look at that little spot right there where that arrow is pointing, that's basically the ear of the katydid. You can see another one on its other front leg, just on its front legs, not on its other legs, on its front set of elbows. That's where it hears. And then katydids also rub their wings together to make sounds for courtship, where grasshoppers rub a leg and a wing together. That's the other minor difference between them. So here's a katydid with its long antenna blowing around in the wind. And then just to make it more complicated, there's also crickets. Crickets tend to have long antenna, so they're closely related to katydids. They're not grasshoppers, but they're in the same group of insects. And then this is a tree cricket, which is another kind of cricket that doesn't look like a cricket. Anyway, so all of those insects, grasshoppers, crickets, tree crickets, katydids, are incredibly important, both in terms of the food that they eat, right? So they're feeding on all kinds of plants, which again, you might think is a bad thing. It's not necessarily. In fact, sometimes when something gets fed on, it produces more leaves, more flowers, things like that. But probably the most important role that it has to play is that it's a food source for other animals. So this is a bird called a grasshopper sparrow. And it's not called that because it eats grasshoppers. It's called that probably because its song sounds like a grasshopper song. But all birds in prairies during the summer are eating insects. And a lot of the insects that they're eating are grasshoppers because that's what's abundant. They're really high in protein and nutrition, and they're easy to catch because there's so many of them. And so grasshoppers, katydids, crickets keep a lot of these grassland birds alive during the summer. And then when those are gone, the birds switch over to seeds if they stick around here during the winter. And then there are some grasshoppers that are pests, right? So there's, out of that 108 species of grasshoppers in Nebraska, there's a handful that are considered to be pest insects. Even those, for the most part, I think maybe exclusively, I think they're all native species that have just adapted really well to the environment that we've created in the last couple hundred years. So here's a couple of grasshoppers in this cornfield, and you can see they've eaten the entire cornfield. No, that was a harvested cornfield, except for the edge here. But those grasshoppers can be a problem. And the reason they can be a problem is they can increase their populations very, very quickly and sort of eat so much that they can really hit a farmer in the pocketbook. Historically, they would have had these kinds of cycles out in prairies, and it never really mattered that much to anybody because they'd be really abundant one year and then not the next year. But today, in the system that we've created, they can become problematic. But again, it's a handful of species. Most grasshoppers are not a problem at all. And again, a lot of them don't even feed on grasses. But if you do have an issue with grasshoppers, one of your friends is the bee fly. So remember the bee fly earlier, it was also called a bee wall because of that stiff proboscis. So as an adult, it's a pollinator. But the other thing that it does is that when it lays its eggs, it will go around, it'll fly around and try to find a grasshopper that's laying its eggs at the same time. And when grasshoppers lay their eggs, they stick their rear end down into the soil and they lay their egg in a little tunnel in the ground, and they lay a whole bunch of eggs in a tunnel, and then they seal it up. And then when the larvae hatch, they stay underground until next spring, usually. What the bee fly does is it hovers around where those grasshoppers are at, and it lays its eggs and it flicks them onto the ground out of the air. So it just hovers above and it flicks its eggs down onto the ground where they can crawl down inside that same tunnel where the grasshopper eggs are. And then when those larvae hatch for the bee fly, they eat the eggs or the larvae or both of the grasshoppers. So I'm going to end with two of, I think, the most fascinating insects that we have, although, man, I could go on again forever and ever and ever, and it probably feels like I am. But the first one is the oil beetle. Oil beetles are a kind of blister beetle. You don't want to smash one of these if it lands on you, because the yellow substance in there is where it gets its name, and they will cause serious blisters on your hand. But otherwise, they're completely harmless. You can hold it and let it walk around on your hand and it won't hurt you. Just don't smush it. But oil beetles, in addition to having that feature, are their larvae, when they're the first stage of their larvae, when they hatch out of eggs, are tiny little things that move around very quickly. And they cluster together in these big clusters, and they emit a pheromone, a chemical, into the air. And it just happens that that chemical smells just like the pheromone of a female bee, which is really attractive to male bees. And so what happens is you have a male bee that will land right on top of this cluster of larvae, and it's just as horny as anything. And as soon as it lands, all those little larvae crawl up on top of the bee. And the male bee is confused and it flies away. And those larvae are just hitchhiking along on that bee. And then when that male bee does find an actual female bee, it'll land on that female bee to mate with the female bee. And all those larvae hop off the male bee and hop onto the female bee. And then they ride the female bee back to her nest, which we saw earlier. And when they get to the nest, they hop off and they crawl down into the hole and they start feeding on the larvae and all the things that poor female bee was trying to protect, which again is not a kind thing to do, but it's part of the system. It's the way that they've evolved. It's a really interesting strategy and one of the more fascinating insects that I know of. But I'm going to end with the insects with the camouflaged looper, which is an inchworm. It's actually a half an inch worm because it's only half an inch long. And it feeds on flowers. But as it feeds on those flowers, it will take pieces of those flowers and every once in a while it'll turn around and it'll glue it to its back. So it has sticky saliva and it's got little hooks on its back. And so it disguises itself. It camouflages itself by building a costume out of the very flower that it's eating. So in the bottom left here, you see purple prairie clover flowers. And this is a camouflage looper. It's eating a purple prairie clover flower. And you can see little bits of flower on its back. When those dry up, it'll replace them with fresh ones. And when it changes to a different kind of flower, it'll change its costume to match. So here's the same species, but this one's on Black-Eyed Susan. And you can see it's camouflaging itself with pieces of the center of that Black-Eyed Susan flower. Just an incredible little bugger that lives in prairies. And they're actually fairly common. And they're found across most of the US, but of course they're very, very, very hard to find. I think I've seen 4 in my life and I look pretty hard for them. So to wrap up, the diversity species we have is really important because that means a diversity of functions and the overlap in those functions creates ecological resilience. So if you are creating habitat, if you're restoring a prairie, if you're putting together a garden in your backyard, the more species of flowers you can use, the better. And the more species of grasses you can use, the better, because that's going to lead to invertebrate diversity, which leads to other kinds of diversity. If you're going to manage those sites, the same thing applies. You want to manage for that diversity. So if you have a small prairie, don't burn the whole prairie at the same time, or you'll wipe out anything that's there that doesn't like that fire. So burn part of the prairie, leave part of the prairie as a refuge. Same thing with mowing. And then try to create different types of habitats in different parts of that area. Have some tall, dense areas because there are species that like that. And then have some really short, sparse areas because there are other species like that. And then you can flip the location of those habitats around year to year. But the more kinds of habitat you can provide, the more species you're going to help and provide for. And then, well, everybody always says education. And I could give a whole presentation on why education is important. You all know it's important. But focus not on just birds and deer and some of those bigger animals that are easy for kids to fall in love with. Help them look more closely at things that are a little bit challenging to find, and they'll love exploring and looking for them. And then the great thing about all these small things, all the little things that I've been talking about is you can help them in your own backyard. So by providing habitat in your backyard that includes a lot of different kinds of native plants. And remember the pollinator, the bee story, where you have to have different plants blooming throughout the entire season to really support those bees. You can do that and you could provide substantial conservation value right in your backyard. So this is my own backyard prairie. Here's world milkweed as an example. That's the species of milkweed those monarchs relied on in 2017. So we were hatching caterpillars out like crazy in our backyard that year in 2017. So what I hope is that I can get you to look more closely at nature, enjoy the different kinds of flowers and the different shapes and sizes that they are. Try to think about what they do, but just enjoy them. And don't forget grasses, by the way. Grasses have flowers too, and some of them are just gorgeous if you get up close to them. Here's milkweed flowers. I didn't talk about how milkweed is pollinated today because that is a really fascinating story. But if you go to my blog, which is prairieecologist.com, I'll show you this again at the end. I just finished a post this week on milkweed pollination. And if you don't know what milkweed pollination looks like, how that happens, I really, really encourage you to read that post. It's an incredible story. And then again, don't forget about insects, all the things that they do above ground, below ground, pollination, predation. And then some of them are just so fascinating to find and look at, right? The different camouflage that they have, or the different bright colors that they have, the roles that they play. Like this one has its proboscis inside a milkweed seed. Things like walking sticks that are really well camouflaged, or the longhorn milkweed beetle that I talked about earlier. Because big animals like bison are really cool, but it's the little things that actually make the world work. So, whew, that was my talk. This is a book that I had that came out this year that I wrote for the Nature Conservancy. I don't make any money off of it, but it's a book about a project I did in 2018 where I photographed everything I could find within 1 little square meter of prairie across a year. It turned into a really fascinating project for me. So if you're interested in that, you can look at the book. But otherwise, I am done. And if anybody's still awake, we can answer questions and have some discussion.
I think, Chris, we'll leave this slide up, and if you don't mind, I'll read the questions from the chat box for you. Let me go. There's quite a few questions here.
Excellent.
There's quite a few comments too. A lot of people said, thanks for offering this. It makes me think of spring for sure. And spring is just right around the corner, right? I'm scrolling down to the questions.
Yeah, I'm looking through them too. Thank you guys for the nice comments. That's really helpful, especially when I can't see anybody's face. It's great to know that everybody's still there and enjoyed it.
Right. At some point, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask a question, but we'll try to get to the written questions. Okay. First question was, please spell the name of that reserve that you mentioned way in the beginning of the program.
Yes, thank you for asking that. Niagara is spelled Niobra. So Niobra, Niobrara, and it's the Niobrara Valley Preserve. And that the Niobrara Scenic River is one of the best places in the whole country to go kayaking or canoeing. There are outfitters that are right there on the river. I encourage you to go. It's a really great trip.
Also, what is the name of the first parasitic plant that you mentioned?
Broom rape. So broom as in broom and rape as in rape. Broom rape, all one word, is the name of that plant.
All right. I think everybody was astounded by that grasshopper. What does your job involve as director of science?
So I started as a land manager, and that's really where my passion is, or a lot of my passion at least. And so I'm still involved in land management, but now I'm doing it in terms of, I'm an advisor to the land managers in Nebraska for the Nature Conservancy and other places to some extent. I do a lot of research and evaluation of the land management we're doing. So we collect data on, how is the grazing and the fire regime that we're using affecting plant diversity or insects or other things. So that's a big part of my job, is the research on the science side. And then the other half of my job, or the other big portion of my job, maybe more than half right now, is what I'm doing right now. It's this outreach work. So writing my books, writing blogs, photos, writing, talking to people. And that I do two things with that. One is I try to share everything we learn from our management and restoration work. I try to capture those lessons and then share them with other people so they can take advantage of that and, have more information that they can use for managing their own sites. And then the second thing is just trying to advocate for prairies in general. Prairies are not necessarily the most charismatic of ecosystems. At least that's what people think. And I try to change that opinion, right? By doing programs like this that show how much is out there if you want to go look for it. So that's really what my job is. There's lots of other things I do, but those are the big things that I work on.
Another question is, tell us more about the Nature Conservancy.
Okay. So the Nature Conservancy is a nonprofit conservation organization. It's actually the largest conservation organization in the world, but a lot of people don't know about us because we are not very often in the news. We are known for land protection, so for buying land or putting various protections on land. That's how we got our start. It's still a big part of who we are. But we also do a lot of other things. We're a very scientific based organization. We have a lot of scientists like me that work in the organization. And we do a lot of, we work very hard to be partners and work behind the scenes a lot of times in collaborative ways. So like with our international work, we almost never do anything internationally without working through a local organization. We just go to local organizations. We say, what do you need? What can we help you with? What can we provide that would let you do your job better? And we do a lot of that in the United States as well. So we're involved in everything from rivers and streams and oceans to prairies and woodlands and deserts and everything in between. You can go to nature.org and learn lots of more about it if you want to.
All right, another question. Can or should native insects be introduced into restoration projects?
Yes, that's a big question. I don't have a good answer for that because science doesn't have a good answer for that. You know, there are risks in doing that. You know, if you bring in an insect that has a disease that isn't in that site and you bring it in, now that disease is in that site. And in small fragmented landscapes, the problem is that if you've got a prairie that's isolated from other prairies, which is the reason that species might not be there, that disease might not be there either. And if that disease comes in and wipes out that species in that prairie, there's not a way for it to sort of recolonize. So there are risks, but I would say that it's probably worth the risk if you're in a site where you're really doing an ecological restoration where you have a lot of scale, like you have a big enough area that you can think you can support a population, but the insect just hasn't found its way there. Introducing it could work. But I would also say that a lot of species almost magically seem to appear in restored prairies. So I don't see it as something that I wouldn't do it automatically. I wouldn't do it just as part of a restoration project. I would say if you do a restoration project and it matures and you're looking at it and you're studying it and you're noticing that there are some important species that are missing, that's when I would start to ask that question and think about it. And I think at that point it might be worth the risk, but I wouldn't do it without a lot of careful consideration.
All right, I'm not sure if this is a question or comment. I'd like to know about oil beetles.
Yeah, well, that was the one that I talked about. So it might be that just they were glad to know about it. If you want to know more about oil beetles or just blister beetles in general, there's all kinds of information online. You can find that whole story I talked about with their little larvae that jump onto bees. It's a really neat thing to look at.
Someone wants to know if you've been bitten by these insects.
Almost never. In fact, like I do, you know, sweep netting exercises with kids, and I talk about insects all the time with groups of kids. And I hold insects in my hand. I'll hold spiders out a lot because I want people to get used to the fact that spiders are not going to kill them. I've never been bit by a spider. I've never been bit by any kind of an insect except maybe things like a little grasshopper will nibble on my finger a little bit and it doesn't break the skin, but it's just trying to figure out what's going on. Or sometimes caterpillars will do the same thing. But,
someone wants to know what your favorite insect is. Hard to choose.
I mean, I suppose the camouflage looper is pretty hard to beat. If I had to pick one, I'd probably go with that. But yeah, it changes every time I find a new one. That's my new favorite.
Someone's asking if, let's see, parasitic plants to fight Indian grass. Does wood betony work?
You know, I don't know what species wood betony acts on, but it's certainly an important plant that can help reduce competition for itself and for other species. We don't have it in the prairies that I work with, so I just don't know a lot about it. What I know is what I hear from other people.
I asked that question myself, Chris, because we have that in northeastern Cook County.
Okay.
We have invasive Indian grass all over our restored prairies around Chicago. And we tried putting in wood betony, thinking that would really, it's supposed to attack Indian grass, but we're not quite sure. So if you have any experience with that.
I don't, but what I would look at is, in terms of management, there are lots of things you can do to try to suppress grasses like Indian grass. And most of them are going to involve, mowing or burning during the period of time just as it's starting to flower. So you know, if you could attack the Indian grass and the other grasses like big bluestem probably too at that same time of year, it kind of replaces the grazing that in our prairie we use to suppress grasses. So we don't have a lot of problems with grass dominance in any prairie that we graze, because those cows are really selecting for those grasses, and they'll eat the grasses and not a lot of the wildflowers, and then we rest the site for a couple of years and we'll graze it again. So you can do that same kind of thing with mowing or fire too.
Okay.
But I just don't know with wood betony how to advise you on that.
Yeah, we do control burns, and the wood betony is such a slow process that it seems to be.
Yeah, but are you burning in the spring or in the summer?
Spring and fall.
Yeah, see, that's helping your Indian grass. And I mean, there's a lot of other reasons to burn spring and fall, but that isn't going to help your Indian grass. And that's where mowing might be something that would be worth looking at, and to try to mow some patches. You don't want to mow the whole thing, of course, but pick out some patches, and maybe for 3 or 4 years, mow one patch in kind of that midsummer, just as it's starting to bloom, and see if it starts to decrease, and then rest that for a few years and try another patch. That would be an option to play with.
Okay, thank you. Good to know.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, someone is asking, do bison help nurture prairies and keep them healthy?
Yes, for sure. I mean, grazing in prairies where you have the scale to host grazing animals like that, they play incredibly important roles. And we were just talking about it with these grasses, right? That because bison and cattle both are specific, they're selective toward grasses. They'll eat other things, but most of their diet comes from grasses. That's what their whole 4-stomach ruminant system is based on, grasses. And so they'll manage competition. They balance out the competition between plants in a prairie in a really important way. But then they're providing habitat structure. So I was talking earlier about when you manage a prairie, you know, trying to have some areas that are tall, some areas that are short, some that are in between, and bison do that. And when you combine them with fire, you burn an area, and just like when I was talking about with sunflowers on the Niagara Valley Preserve, where we burned a big area, all the bison in that pasture spent almost their entire year grazing where we had burned, because that's where the most nutritious grass growth is, which means they're grazing over there. They're not grazing the rest of it. The rest of it gets nice and tall. And then when that burns, the bison shift over there, and you get this, what we call a shifting mosaic of habitats that provides a lot of different habitat structure for animals and different kinds of growing conditions for plants. So in that way, they are an architect, or they're an artist in terms of providing different kinds of habitats, but they're also very closely tied to fire. And they're not, you know, grazing, whether you're talking about bison or cattle, it's not appropriate in a lot of prairies, right? That are too small, or they have other issues. That bison are messy, cattle are messy. They eat a lot of different things. They stomp on things. They poop all over the place. And in a big prairie, there's room for all of that, and it's absorbed and it's important. In a small site, it's a little trickier to manage.
All right, another question. What would the making of unfertilized mosquito impact the ecosystems?
So I think what you're asking about is they're trying to sterilize populations of mosquitoes in certain places, especially where they're having disease problems. It's a really interesting process, and you know, I don't know for sure. There are a lot of things that eat mosquito larvae, especially mosquito larvae are really important food sources. And then there's things, of course, like bats, right? That eat adult mosquitoes. You hear about that all the time. Bats eat so many mosquitoes a night or whatever. The question is, if mosquitoes disappeared, what would replace them, right? Is there an overlapping sort of redundancy there? And I think most likely, yes. You know, if all the mosquitoes disappeared tomorrow, I don't know that we would miss them terribly. But I also don't know that for sure. There may be species out there that really do rely specifically on those larvae, and I just don't know for sure. I think most of us might vote to take the chance if we could, I guess.
Many people are asking about the recording, and yes, the program's being recorded. It will be released next week. I will send out a link in an email tomorrow so you can sign up for the recording. Do insects prefer pollen from perennials versus annuals?
Oh, no, not really. I mean, there are some pollinators that prefer a certain species over others, but there's no sort of automatic advantage one way or the other between perennials and annuals, as far as I know.
And then someone wants to know, are most prairie plant flowers perennials?
Probably the majority of species are. perennials, but it really depends on what kind of prairie and where you're at geographically. And also, honestly, it depends on the management history of that site, right? If you've got a prairie that is managed in a way that really caters toward perennials because it's managed in the same way with, for example, burning it every year or burning it really regularly, and there's not a lot of grazing or drought or mowing or anything that sort of controls those dominant perennials, then it's going to be really heavily dominated by perennials. If you have a site that has sort of a bigger mix of different types of disturbances, of management treatments, you tend to have a bigger diversity of prairie species, including a lot more annuals and biennials, some of the short-lived plants. But in general, I would say there's probably more perennials than annuals.
All right, someone wants to know if you've ever heard of the Salt Creek Tiger Beetle Conservation Project.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska has been real active in that partnership. In fact, we started the Saline Wetlands Conservation Partnership back in the early 90s. And we, for a while, owned some of the salt marshes around Lincoln, which is where the Salt Creek Tiger Beetle lives. If you're not familiar with that, you might be surprised to hear that there are salt marshes in Nebraska. But there are, and it was a major source of income for the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, when it was young, until the railroads came through and went all the way to Utah and Salt Lake City happened. But those salt marshes are shrinking; they're being taken over by the city, and the Salt Creek Tiger Beetle, which is a very rare subspecies of tiger beetle, is disappearing. There's like a couple of hundred every year that they can find now, which for an insect, that's an incredibly low number. So yeah, I know them. They're a beautiful insect. I'm not super optimistic about their future, but I'm hopeful.
Someone wants to know if sandhill cranes impact the prairie.
They do. Not in a serious way or a big impactful way, but so in Nebraska, where I'm at on the Central Platte River, the sandhill cranes migrate through in these huge numbers, right? So we'll have 500, 600,000 of them a year along about an 80-mile stretch of the Platte River. And so just those numbers, they're feeding on insects, they're poking holes in the prairie, trying to pull insects out of the prairie. And they can, in some areas, they'll do that enough that it almost looks like somebody came in with a rototiller in some areas. But by about 3 or 4 weeks into the growing season, you can't even tell where that happened, right? So they're not tearing plants out of the ground or anything like that in any kind of a way that causes serious issues. So there's some minor impacts, and I'm sure just the fact that they're pooping in the prairie is going to have some nutrient impacts, but nothing. I don't think of them as something that really changes the way prairies act. But it's really nice having them around.
There's a comment here from Dana that says Fermilab Natural Areas uses wood betony as a hemiparasitic to control Indian grass.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Someone wants to know, are the small white tips on the ends of the antennae of many types of butterflies the sensing parts of the antenna?
I assume so, but I honestly don't know that for sure. With moths, the moth antennae are fuzzy because that's how they're catching the pheromone. The males are the fuzzier ones because they're catching the pheromones of the females. I don't know enough about the anatomy of a butterfly antenna to be able to tell you that. I know that that's the way you can tell them apart, right? A butterfly has those little knobs at the tip and a moth doesn't, and that's the way you can tell the difference, but I just don't know.
And can you talk about how you photograph up close to capture the tiny world? That might be a whole program on its own.
Yeah. So I use a macro lens on my camera. I shoot with a Nikon camera. It's not an expensive camera, really. Well, that's a relative term, right? You could buy it used for less than $1,000, which is a ton of money, but it's not nearly as expensive as some other cameras you can find. So I have a Nikon D7100, if anybody cares. It's kind of the lower tier of Nikon cameras, digital cameras. And then I have a 105 millimeter macro lens, which means that it's a little bit longer macro lens than some other options. And it allows me to keep a little bit of distance between me and the insects that I'm photographing, for example. It's not as important with flowers. They're not going to run away. But so the equipment is part of it. I use a tripod almost all the time when I'm doing macro photos. It helps really stabilize the camera. It also means that I'm, when you're photographing an insect that's moving around on a flower and the flower is moving around in the wind, having one part of the equation that's not moving really helps. So having my camera be able to stay still is really helpful. And then honestly, the biggest thing that helps is patience, because the majority of insects that I try to get a photograph of leave the scene before I can capture them. And you just have to kind of expect that and get used to it. And I'm seeing Suzanne's follow up here on the Viceroy and the white dots on the antenna. I just don't know. Actually, the photo that's up now is painted lady butterflies, and instead not Viceroys, but although I can see where you would see that. Painted ladies are their own really cool species. They come out of the desert Southwest every year, and they have these eruptions in population. When the population gets big enough, they all leave the desert Southwest. They move up into our part of the world. And then a lot of times in the fall, you can see them migrating back down south. And back in 2017, I think it was, there were so many painted lady butterflies coming across the sky in Colorado, they got picked up on the radar at the Denver airport, which is pretty astounding to think about. Did we run out of questions? We get them all?
Is it effective to use a trail camera to capture insects who visit flowers?
Ooh, I've never tried it. I'm trying to think if I've seen anybody do that. I think your off-the-shelf trail camera would be really tough, because most of them aren't going to be able to focus close enough that you'd be able to, get the kind of picture you'd want of an insect. But you can certainly create what are called camera traps, which is basically the same idea, but they tend to be, they use a higher end camera with a higher end lens. So more like, it'd be like taking my camera, put it on a tripod or in some kind of a stable situation, and then having it trigger in some way, which, when an insect flies in front of it, would take the picture. You could set up something like that, I think. The problem would be, trying to pick a flower that is going to get enough visitation that it's worth your while. But I don't know why you couldn't do it. The other big challenge would be, that flower is going to be moving around in the wind, like I was just talking about. And so you'd have the vast majority of your shots would be blurry, I'm afraid, unless you could somehow stabilize that flower, stake it down or something so it's not moving. And then it might work. It'd be a really interesting project. And then I see the question, what is a trail camera? So trail cameras are used by hunters and other people. I mean, you can set them out just to see what kind of goes past on a trail. So it's a small camera in a box it's a fairly limited camera usually in a lot of ways, but many of them now can either take still photos or videos or both. And a lot of them will take pictures at night, either with flashes or because they have sort of a dark vision to them. They can see the infrared. And they can be a great way to see, what's moving around out there when we're not.
I think that's the last written question. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, you're welcome to do so. Thank you, Chris, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you for the Nature Conservancy for all the work you do.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I've got time if anybody else has other questions, but we timed it just right, it looks like.
Yep.
And you can contact me. My email address is right there on the screen too. So if there's something you think of later, or if you want to follow up on any things I talked about, I'd be more than happy to have more discussion with you later.